Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. When we look back at the history of global finance, we often find ourselves staring at spreadsheets, dates, and numbers, where we just lose ourselves in the cold hard mechanics of balance sheets. But today, we are going to talk about something a little bit deeper. We are going to look at a story that is fundamentally about trust, about what happens when the bonds of honesty that hold our economic system together are slowly and quietly stripped away. My name is Aishwarya Numa, and this is the story of the rise and the catastrophic fall of Parmalat. And as we examine this case today, we are not just looking at an isolated incident of bad business decisions. We are performing a forensic dissection of systemic failure. Because by understanding how a global household named hid 14 billion euros in debt right in plain sight, we learn how to build a more transparent and more accountable future. Now, to understand where this story ends and how it ends, we have to understand how it originally began. It starts with a simple, hopeful premise. A man named Callisto Tanzi takes a modest local milk pasteurization plant in Parma, Italy, and through sheer ambition transforms it into a global powerhouse. And for a long time, it looked like triumph of global enterprise. At its peak, Parmalat operated in 30 countries. It put food on the tables of 30,000 workers. It generated over 7 billion euros in annual revenue, where Parmalat itself earned its place as Italy's eighth largest industrial group. But beneath that shiny, successful facade, a dangerous pattern was taking root. This massive global expansion, buying up everything from bakeries to sport teams, was funded almost entirely by borrowing. And to keep that illusion of endless growth alive, to keep the credit flowing, executive began constructing an incredibly complex, fragile web of international finance. And yet, history teaches us that what takes decades to build can vanish in a matter of days. In the cold winter of 2003, the cracks in the foundation finally burst wide open. Started back on December 8th, when Parmalat shocked the markets by admitting they could not access their own investments in a Cayman-based fund. Almost immediately, Standard and Poor's cut their credit rating to junk. But the real devastating blow came 11 days later, on December 19th, where Bank of America stepped forward and delivered a bombshell. For the 3.95 billion euro account held by Parmalat's Cayman subsidiary, Bonlat, did not exist at all. The document confirming it was crude, homemade forgery. So, by Christmas Eve, the illusion was completely shattered. The company filed for bankruptcy protection under a mountain of 14 billion euros in hidden liabilities. The empire was entirely gone. It is basically just a stark reminder of how fragile our systems can be when they are built on a foundation of sand. And so we have to ask ourselves, and this brings us to our first discussion question: how did we miss it? What signs should we have noticed? So, when you look closely at the years leading up to the crash, the warning signs were not hidden at all. They were standing right out in the open. First, there was what we call the debt cash paradox. Ask yourself, if a company is truly sitting on billions of euros in highly liquid cash reserves, why are they constantly issuing new expensive high yield corporate bonds? It defies common sense. You don't just take out high interest credit card debt when your bank account is simply overflowing. And second, they were trapped in a Ponzi style liquidity cycle because their actual day to day business was losing money. They had to keep borrowing new money just to pay interest on the old money. And finally, they relied on highly opaque offshore vehicles like Bonlet in the Cayman Islands using them essentially as financial trash bins to hide uncollectible debts and generate fake paper transactions. The signs were there. We just chose not to look. Now, this brings us to the gatekeepers, our second question. How did the external auditors and banks contribute to this collapse? You see, a market economy only works when there is a basic level of trust, and we rely on auditors to protect that trust. But in this case, global giants like Grant Thornton and Deloitte essentially rubber stamped Parmalat's books. Most shockingly, they accepted homemade forged bank letters printed on ordinary paper. They failed to perform the most basic mandatory check by picking up the phone or writing a letter to verify the balances directly with the Bank of America. So, if we were a risk manager looking at this today, what would be the lesson? How would we prevent this from ever happening again? It's never about cynicism. It's about smart modern safeguards. Therefore, we must implement blind electronic confirmation systems that completely bypass corporate management, where it would just transfer data directly from the bank to the auditor. On top of that, we must also enforce strict mandatory audit partner rotations so that cozy multi-decade relationships can never again cloud an auditor's independent judgment. Now, the third challenge we have to grapple with is the sheer geographic scale of this fraud. The architects of the scheme understood that we live in a globalized world, and they used that globalization to their advantage. They created complex multi-jurisdictional web to evade accountability. First, they practiced regulatory arbitrage. They intentionally set up subsidiaries in loose tax havens like the Cayman Islands. They played strict local bank secrecy laws against the regulatory oversight of Italy's consulate. Second, they used evidence isolation by routing transactions through shells, like when in the Netherlands, they kept the smoking gun documents safely out of reach of domestic Italian investigators. And then, when the collapse finally came, pursuing justice meant navigating massive sovereign walls, coordinating investigations, extraditing executives, and recovering assets across different legal systems took them years. This shows us that when fraud goes global, our corporation and our law and our laws must go global too. Now, this brings us to the core ethical question of the case, question that gets to the very heart of corporate character. Where is the line between aggressive financial engineering and outright fraud? So, for a long time, the insiders of Parmalat claimed that they were not trying to steal. That they were just using creative accounting and complex structures to keep a struggling business afloat during volatile economic times in Latin America. But let's be clear, there is a bright, uncompromisable line. Financial engineering, like securitization and tax optimization, is completely legal. But the moment you actively forge bank letters, falsify records, and invent billions of euros out of thin air to deceive investors, that is not engineering anymore. That is fraud. That is a crime, and any defense of good intentions was completely shattered when forensic audits revealed a clear motive of personal enrichment. Callisto Tanzo had personally diverted roughly $620 million of company money into his own family's private accounts to fund luxury travel and private assets. At the end of the day, you cannot borrow your way to prosperity on a foundation of lies. So, how do we recover? When the damage is done and the rubble is cleared, how do we protect the innocent stakeholders? Let's take a look at our fifth question through the lens of Enrico Bondi, the extraordinary commissioner appointed to pick up the pieces. Bondi did not just manage a bankruptcy, he executed a masterclass in this crisis leadership. He prioritized three clear, bold actions, where first he pursued aggressive litigation. So he did not just sell off assets for pennies on the dollar. He launched massive lawsuits against the international investment banks that had helped engineer those deceptive bond structures. And second, he also brought a relentless focus back to the core business, cut away the bleeding non-core distractions like the sport clubs and private aviation fleets and the entire shebang, and protected the highly profitable, structurally sound global dairy brand. And third, he executed a sophisticated debt equity swap, giving verified creditors a real stake in newly structured Nova Parmalat. He turned victims into owners and rebuilt the value from the ground up. Ultimately, the legacy of Parmalat is not just the club itself, it is the lasting reform that followed in its wake. If we look at this transition, we can see how the painful lessons of that era built the modern safeguards that we rely on today. We replaced audit monopolies with mandatory firm rotations. We closed the offshore loopholes by mandating strict consolidation of special purpose vehicles. We streamlined bankruptcy laws to protect operational value, and we demanded that the boardrooms be run with independent, rigorous audit committees. Out of the wreckage of 2003, we built a more resilient system. The collapse of Parmalat remains a powerful cautionary tale. It is a reminder that unchecked leverage, blind trust, and a lack of transparency will eventually catch up with us. But it also reminds us that with clear eyed leadership, vigorous standards, and a commitment to truth, we can always restore accountability and protect the integrity of our markets. Thank you so much for your time, your focus, and your attention today. It has been an absolute privilege being able to tell this story to you. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.